The ceasefire dies in 72 hours. Here's what happens at midnight. Right now, as you are watching this, the clock is not a metaphor. It is a real countdown running in real time inside every defense ministry, every intelligence briefing room, and every war room that matters on this planet. In the last 24 hours, Iran reimposed restrictions on the Strait of Hormuz, the single most strategically important waterway on Earth, and they did it deliberately, precisely, and with full knowledge of what it would trigger. The U.S. blockade is still holding. The ceasefire framework that was stitched together after weeks of desperate backdoor diplomacy is now sitting on a table in Islamabad with no signatures and no second meeting confirmed. And if nothing changes before April 21st, the whole structure simply expires, not collapses dramatically, not gets torn apart in a final confrontation. It just quietly dies. And that quiet death is more dangerous than any explosion you have ever seen. This is Geo Insight Command, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines even know what happened. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay ahead, because what you are about to hear is just the beginning. Here is what you need to understand before anything else. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water. It is not just a shipping lane. It is the pressure point of the entire global energy system. 20% of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow corridor every single day. Nearly a third of all liquefied natural gas traded internationally passes through those waters. When Iran moves to restrict that strait, they are not firing a missile. They are pulling a lever that makes the entire global economy shudder simultaneously, and they know it. They have always known it. But here is what most people miss. Here is the part that military analysts are already warning about in classified briefings that are now beginning to leak. Iran is not using the strait as a military weapon right now. They are using it as a negotiation weapon. And that distinction changes everything. Think about what that means for a moment. A military weapon gets fired once. It destroys, it damages, it forces a response. But a negotiation weapon can be held indefinitely. It can be raised and lowered, tightened and relaxed, calibrated with surgical precision based on what the other side offers at the table. Every hour that blockade holds is not just an economic threat. It is leverage, real, tangible, compounding leverage. And the longer the clock runs without a deal, the more leverage accumulates on Iran's side of the board. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that the ceasefire framework itself was never built to survive this kind of pressure. Let's go back to what happened in Islamabad, because the details matter enormously here. After a marathon 21-hour negotiating session, delegations from both sides walked away from the table without an agreement. 21 hours. That is not a failed meeting. That is a war of attrition disguised as diplomacy. Sources who were close to the room have described the atmosphere as controlled but deeply fractured. Both sides came in with positions that appeared negotiable on the surface, but contained conditions that the other side could not realistically accept. And after 21 hours of going in circles, the delegations did not schedule a second meeting. That detail is more significant than almost anything else in this story, because a second meeting not being confirmed is not a pause. It is the sound of a framework quietly losing oxygen. And this is where things get worse. The ceasefire framework was designed with a very specific expiration architecture. It was not open-ended. It was not indefinitely renewable. It had a hard deadline built into its structure from the beginning, and that deadline falls on April 21st. If no agreement is reached, if no extension is formally confirmed, the framework simply lapses. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with a final press conference. It just stops being valid. And the moment it stops being valid, every military positioning that was frozen under its terms becomes operational again. Every strike window that was paused gets reopened. Every targeting calculation that was suspended gets reactivated. What was a diplomatic pause becomes a tactical reset. And both sides know exactly what that means. Now let's talk about the U.S. blockade, because this is the layer that most analysts are underweighting. The United States has maintained a naval blockade posture in the region that is, by any objective military measurement, extraordinary in its scale and concentration. Intelligence reports suggest that the naval assets currently positioned in proximity to the strait represent one of the largest concentrated deployments of U.S. naval power in this region in well over a decade. That is not a defensive posture. That is a statement. And Iran reimposing strait restrictions in direct response to what they are calling U.S. violations of the original deal means that both sides are now in a posture where neither can back down without it looking like a strategic defeat. The reality is that a superpower does not move carrier groups and destroyer escorts into a waterway and then quietly sail them home because the other side asked nicely. And a regional power that has spent decades building its strategic identity around resistance and deterrence does not reopen a strait it just symbolically closed without getting something tangible in return. That is the trap they are both in right now. And the clock is running. But here is the deeper layer. Here is the part that defense experts understand, but that almost nobody is saying loudly enough. Iran's reimposition of strait restrictions today is directly connected to the nuclear negotiations, not as a side issue, not as a related but separate track. It is the same negotiation. The strait is the lever Iran is using to extract concessions on the nuclear file. Every tanker that gets held, every shipping insurance rate that spikes, every barrel of oil that doesn't move through those waters adds to the economic pressure on the international community to force Washington toward a more accommodating position on the nuclear deal. Iran has calculated correctly that the world will tolerate military tension in the abstract for a long time, but that the world will not tolerate sustained disruption to global energy supply for more than a few weeks before the phone calls to Washington become very, very urgent. And this is where the hidden dependency becomes critical. The global energy market is more fragile right now than at almost any point in recent memory. Strategic reserves in several key economies are not at levels that can comfortably absorb a prolonged disruption of Hormuz traffic. Defense analysis from independent research institutes has been warning for months that the assumption of uninterrupted Hormuz access was a systemic vulnerability embedded in almost every major economy's energy planning. The assumption was so baked in, so foundational, that planners stopped treating it as a risk and started treating it as a constant. And when something that was a constant suddenly becomes a variable, the models break, the pricing breaks, the supply chains break, and it breaks fast. We saw the first tremors of this today. Energy markets reacted immediately when word spread about Iran's reimposition. But here is what's telling. The reaction was sharp, but not panicked. And that's because markets are still operating under the assumption that this gets resolved, that someone blinks, that the diplomats figure it out, that the ceasefire somehow gets extended or replaced before the 72-hour window closes. And that assumption may be the most dangerous thing in this entire situation, because it means the real shock, the real repricing of global risk has not happened yet. It is waiting on the other side of April 21. And if the framework expires without a deal, that shock is going to arrive all at once. But that's not the real problem either. The real problem is the military escalation geometry. Because when you strip away all the diplomatic language and look at pure force positioning, what you see is a situation where both sides have moved into configurations that are very difficult to de-escalate without one side making a visible concession. And visible concessions in this part of the world, at this level of tension, carry enormous domestic political costs for both sides. Iranian leadership cannot be seen yielding to U.S. naval pressure without it reading domestically as capitulation after years of resistance posturing. The U.S. cannot be seen standing down its blockade posture in response to Iranian strait restrictions without it reading internationally as retreat in the face of coercion. Both of these political constraints are real. Both of them are significant, and both of them make the logical diplomatic off-ramp much harder to find than it should theoretically be. Military analysts are already warning that the window for a negotiated extension of the ceasefire is narrowing faster than the public timeline suggests. The 72-hour public deadline is the official framework, but the operational planning timelines for both sides are shorter than that. Military systems do not reset instantaneously. They have preparation cycles, targeting cycles, readiness states that have to be moved through before an operation can actually begin. What that means practically is that if fighting is going to resume after April 24th, decisions about that resumption are likely already being made or will need to be made within the next 24 to 36 hours, not 72. The clock the public is watching is not the same clock the generals are watching, and that gap between the public timeline and the operational timeline is where things can go wrong in ways that become very hard to reverse. Let's talk about the options, because there are only a few paths forward from here, and none of them are clean. And this matters, because understanding why every option is flawed is what lets you understand why this situation is genuinely as dangerous as it looks. Option 1 is the negotiated extension. Both sides agree, formally or informally, to extend the ceasefire framework past April 21st, buy more time, and return to the table in Islamabad or some other venue. On paper, this sounds simple. In practice, it requires Iran to accept a framework extension without getting the concessions it walked into Islamabad demanding. It requires the U.S. to agree to an extension while its naval posture continues to generate Iranian accusations of bad faith, and it requires a second meeting to be scheduled and confirmed in less than 72 hours. The logistics alone are nearly impossible, but more importantly, the political will for a clean extension does not appear to exist on either side right now. An extension without progress looks like weakness, and neither side is willing to absorb that optic. Option 2 is a partial deal. Some concessions on the nuclear file in exchange for a partial reopening of the strait, with the ceasefire extended conditionally. This is the version that diplomats in the back channels are almost certainly working on. But partial deals in this environment are extraordinarily fragile. They require trust in implementation that neither side currently has for the other. They require verification mechanisms that take time to establish. And they create domestic political problems for both governments because partial deals look like half victories. And half victories in high-stakes standoffs tend to be treated by domestic audiences as half defeats. The probability of a partial deal surviving its own announcement is low. Option 3 is controlled escalation. One side takes a limited, calibrated action designed to force the other side to make a decision. This is the most dangerous option because controlled escalation has a very poor historical record of staying controlled. Every actor who has ever chosen controlled escalation has believed at the moment of choosing it that they understood where the escalation would stop, and the historical record suggests that confidence is almost always misplaced. Controlled escalation, once begun, generates its own logic. Responses are never perfectly calibrated. Domestic pressures on both sides accelerate, and what was meant to be a limited action becomes the first chapter of something much larger. Option 4 is that the framework expires and fighting simply resumes at its previous level, with the international community scrambling to broker a new ceasefire from a lower starting position. This is the outcome that intelligence reports suggest is currently being treated as the baseline assumption in several capitals, not the hoped-for outcome, the baseline assumption. What that tells you is that the people with access to the full picture have already reduced their expectations to the point where they are planning for resumption rather than planning for resolution. That is a significant and deeply concerning shift in the underlying risk calculation. Option 5 is that one side backs down decisively. Iran reopens the strait fully without concessions, or the U.S. withdraws its blockade posture without conditions. Defense experts understand that neither of these is operationally realistic given current domestic political environments on both sides, but they are theoretically on the table, and they are worth naming because the fact that the option exists but is politically inaccessible is itself a measure of how trapped both sides are. There is no good option. That is the conclusion every analytical framework leads to when you run it honestly. There are options that are less immediately catastrophic than others, but none of them produce a clean, stable resolution. The best available outcome right now is a managed delay that buys time for conditions to change. And managed delays have a tendency to become the new baseline, which means the underlying problem continues to compound. And this is where the global dimension becomes impossible to ignore, because this is not just a US-Iran confrontation anymore. It stopped being that some time ago. The regional architecture around this standoff now involves a cluster of actors whose interests are only partially aligned and whose responses to escalation are not coordinated. Gulf states with significant economic exposure to Hormuz disruption are watching this with a level of anxiety that their public diplomatic language significantly understates. Asian economies, particularly those with the highest dependence on Gulf energy flows, are running contingency calculations that they have not had to run at this level of seriousness for a long time. European capitals, dealing simultaneously with their own energy security pressures, are watching the Islamabad failure with alarm because the failure of that framework is not a contained regional event. It is a signal about the current state of great power diplomacy more broadly. Intelligence reports suggest that at least two permanent members of the UN Security Council have been engaged in parallel back-channel communications with both Tehran and Washington over the last 48 hours. The nature of those communications is not fully clear from open-source reporting, but the fact that those communications are happening at all and are apparently not producing visible results tells you something important about the depth of the impasse. When the big players are already in the room and the needle isn't moving, the structural problem is not a lack of attention. It is a lack of architecture for a solution that both primary parties can accept. The truth is, the world has not built the diplomatic infrastructure for this particular crisis. The frameworks that exist were designed for different configurations of power, different threat environments, different political incentives. And when you try to run a 21st century crisis through 20th century diplomatic machinery, the gears don't mesh the way they used to. And here is the part that makes everything feel more precarious than the public narrative has captured. The Strait restriction is not just about oil. It is not just about nuclear negotiations. It is a test of something much more fundamental. It is a test of whether coercive leverage still works in a world where every major actor has been burned by the consequences of miscalculation. Iran is betting that the economic pain of Hormuz disruption will be intolerable enough to force a diplomatic movement before the deadline. The U.S. is betting that maintaining its posture is the only way to prevent the leverage from being validated. Both bets are logical. Both bets could be wrong. And if both bets are wrong simultaneously, the ceasefire doesn't just expire, it explodes. Military analysts are already flagging something that has received almost no public attention. The concentration of military assets in the region right now creates an environment where accidental escalation is a non-trivial risk. When you have large naval formations operating in close proximity, under conditions of high political tension, with communications protocols that are stressed and trust that is near zero, the probability of an incident that neither side intended, but that neither side can politically afford to de-escalate, is not small. History is full of these incidents. They rarely look like decisions in the moment. They look like accidents, technical failures, miscommunications, but they produce consequences that are politically irreversible. And the architecture of the current standoff has created conditions where that kind of accidental trigger is operating as a real risk, not a theoretical one. The next 36 to 48 hours are the most operationally critical window in this entire situation, not the 72-hour public deadline. The 36 to 48-hour window before that deadline when military planners have to make decisions about readiness states, when political leaders have to decide whether they are willing to accept a bad deal or prepare for resumed conflict, when the back channel communications either produce something or they don't. This is the window that is not being talked about. This is where the real story is unfolding right now. And the viewer who understands that window, who grasps that the public clock and the operational clock are not synchronized, is watching this very differently than someone who thinks there are still 72 hours of buffer. The buffer is shorter than it looks. The decisions are closer than the headlines suggest, and the margin for error is smaller than anyone is comfortable admitting. Here is what a new world order framing of this crisis looks like. Because when you step back from the immediate tactical picture and look at what this moment represents structurally, something important comes into focus. The international system has been built since roughly the 1990s on a set of assumptions about U.S. military dominance that were taken as near permanent features of global reality. One of those assumptions was that the United States had the capability and the political will to keep critical waterways open, and that this capability was essentially unchallengeable by regional powers. Iran's reimposition of strait restrictions today is, at one level, a direct challenge to that assumption. It is a demonstration that a regional power with asymmetric capabilities and high tolerance for economic pain can impose costs on the global system that force even the dominant power into a reactive posture. That is not a small thing. That is a fundamental data point about the current limits of American coercive power. What that means is that other regional actors are watching, not just allies, adversaries. Every government that has ever calculated how far it can push before the U.S. pushes back is running an updated calculation based on what they observe in the next 72 hours. If the ceasefire expires without a decisive U.S. response that restores the strategic equation, that observation gets incorporated into strategic planning around the world. Not immediately, not loudly, but permanently. Defense experts understand that the credibility dimension of this crisis is as important as the immediate military and economic dimensions, possibly more important in the long run, because military hardware can be rebuilt, economic losses can be recovered, but strategic credibility, once eroded, takes years to reconstruct, and it is almost never fully reconstructed. It is replaced by a new equilibrium, a new baseline of what is and isn't possible, and that new baseline tends to be permanently less favorable to the power that was seen to blink. This is the weight of the next 72 hours, not just whether there is a ceasefire deal, not just whether oil flows through the strait. The question underneath all of those questions is what kind of world emerges on the other side of April 21, a world where the existing framework holds, where deterrence functions, where the architecture of pressure and counterpressure produces a deal, or a world where the framework has expired, where a regional power has demonstrated that it can impose sustained costs on the global system without decisive consequence, and where every subsequent crisis happens against the backdrop of that precedent. The reality is that both of those worlds are possible right now. The probability is not fixed. It is being determined in real time by decisions that are being made in rooms most people will never see, by leaders under pressures most people will never fully understand, against a clock that is ticking at a speed most people do not realize. There are three questions that are going to determine everything over the next 72 hours, and none of them have clear answers right now, which is precisely why this moment is so genuinely dangerous. The first question is whether the back-channel communications that are apparently ongoing between major powers and the primary parties produce anything concrete enough to form the basis of an emergency extension before the operational window closes. Not a full deal. Just enough of a signal to justify both sides standing down from their current posture for long enough to keep talking. That signal has to come very soon. Every hour without it makes the next hour harder. The second question is whether Iran's calculation about economic pain tolerance is correct. If the international community, and specifically the major economies with the highest exposure to Hormuz disruption, applies enough pressure on Washington to produce movement on the nuclear file within the next 48 hours, Iran's strategy works exactly as designed. If that pressure does not materialize quickly enough, Iran faces the choice of backing down from its straight restrictions at no political gain, or holding them through the ceasefire expiration and entering resumed conflict with a much higher level of international isolation than it can comfortably sustain. The third question is the one nobody wants to ask out loud. If an incident occurs, if something happens in the Strait over the next 48 to 72 hours that neither side planned and neither side can easily back away from, does the political and diplomatic infrastructure exist to contain it before it becomes something that neither side can control? The honest answer from every independent defense analysis available is that this infrastructure is weaker right now than it has been at any point in this standoff. Communication channels are under stress. Trust is near zero. Domestic political pressures on both sides are pulling toward hardness rather than flexibility. And the concentration of forces creates the physical conditions for accidents. That combination is not reassuring. What you are watching right now is not a news story. It is not a diplomatic update. It is a system under maximum stress at the moment of maximum fragility, with a timer running and the exits narrowing. The ceasefire was never supposed to be this fragile. The Strait was never supposed to become a nuclear negotiating weapon. The 21-hour Islamabad session was never supposed to end without even a second meeting confirmed. Something was missed. Something failed at a level that the official narrative has not fully accounted for. And whatever was missed, whatever created the conditions for this particular confluence of pressures at this particular moment, it matters enormously because it is the thing that would need to be fixed for a real resolution to be possible. And right now, there is no evidence that anyone has identified it, let alone fixed it. The next 72 hours are real. The clock is real. The consequences are real. And the only question that matters now is whether the people with the power to change the outcome have the clarity, the courage, and the time to do it. Stay with Geo Insight Command, because when this breaks, and it will break in one direction or another, you will want to have understood how we got here.